Moment Pro Camera 2 is a complete rebuild of the original Moment camera app, aiming to give iPhone users professional-grade manual control over both photos and video. At first glance, this new version has a pretty clean, intuitive interface, as well as advanced features like Open Gate Video. If you have an iPhone 17 Pro, you've got LUTs support for both photos and videos. And you've also got exposure priority modes. And that's something that you don't get in the Blackmagic app. That said, since it is new, there are a few things that are still missing or, in the works. For example, it doesn't yet support recording directly to external SSDs. Because it's made by Moment, you also get full support for all their conversion lenses. So if you've got Moment lenses, the app is going to help you squeeze or de-squeeze the most out of them. So let's go through these controls. Now, I'm using an iPhone 17 Pro, but if you have an earlier model, you will most likely have less options available. By default, the app is set to photo mode, and you just swipe on the mode button to switch modes. And if you tap it, you open this kind of bigger switch, but it doesn't actually do anything else, so there's no real reason to do that. So the big round circle, obviously that's the shutter button or the record button, depending on which mode you're in. When the app is recording, the button becomes a square and you get a counter at the top. At the top, in the middle, you will find the current camera settings. So tap that to open up the settings. And once the settings are open, you're going to have this menu at the top, which has 4 tabs. And each tab gives you access to specific settings. So in photo mode, we've got format, we've got codec, we've got megapixels, and then we've got aspect ratio. Under format, we have 4 different options for processing. We've got natural, standard, raw, and pro raw. So natural is a mode that produces images with kind of minimal in-camera processing, and it aims for a more true-to-life, unprocessed look. As standard is basically a typical iPhone default format, and you're going to get Apple's computational processes, in full. For example, the regular tone mapping, the sharpening, noise reduction, as well as HDR effects. Shooting in RAW saves the sensor data with very little processing, and that means that you get a file that requires editing but offers the most flexibility for adjustments like exposure, white balance, and detail recovery. Apple's ProRAW is a hybrid format that retains raw sensor data, but it layers in computational photography features, like Deep Fusion and Smart HDR. And this gives you a better looking raw base file with greater editing freedom than the standard mode. And this is going to combine detail and flexibility with the benefits of iPhone image processing. And below that, we can choose manual exposure mode, and it's basically Fusion on or off. Fusion combines multiple images to create a single high-quality photo with enhanced detail and better low-light performance. So if you disable this, then you're going to get a less processed image. And finally, you can choose how much Fusion you want, should you decide to use it. For codecs, we can choose between HEIF, JPEG, and TIFF. So HEIF is not as compatible, but it uses more advanced compression. JPEG, which is very compatible with pretty much any platform or system. And then we've got, finally, TIFF, which is for bigger, uncompressed files. Now, you're going to get different options here depending on what you have selected under formats. So for example, you can choose natural as a format, and then you'll get the option to keep raw under the codec. And if you toggle this on, after you take a photo, in the Photos app, you're going to see it says JPEG and RAW. And that means that this photo is stored in both JPEG and RAW versions. So you can actually choose to save them as separate files in your Photos app. So tap the settings cog and then just toggle off Combine RAW Processed. So next we have resolution, and we can choose between 12 megapixel or 48 megapixel photos. But this will depend on what other settings you have. So for example, if you have it set to natural processing, you can only select 12 megapixels. Aspect ratio gives you 5 settings to choose from, so just tap to select. And if you want to see your framing without these bars at the sides, just select crop. In video mode, we also have 4 tabs, which are codec, resolution, color space, and then frame rate. there's 3 codecs to choose from. We've got H.264, H.265, otherwise known as HEVC, and ProRes. But there is, as yet, no ProRes RAW for iPhone 17 Pro users. So I think most of you probably know what these are, but these are the kinds of things that I cover in my book, Smartphone Videography Beginner to Advanced. Basically, anything that you need to know about shooting video with your smartphone is in that book. For bitrate, we can just let the iPhone choose, or we can fix it at medium or high. And if you want the highest quality video at the cost of bigger files, then choose high. And I think this might be the first time that I've seen a chroma subsampling option in a camera app. Now, 422 retains more color information than 420, and it gives you this kind of crisper, cleaner color details with, less color bleeding or fuzziness. And this is going to be important for color grading, obviously, but also for chroma keying. And of course, again, there's always the downside, and that's that you end up with larger file sizes. Now, 422 is actually required to shoot both versions of Apple Log. For resolution, we have SD, HD, and 4K, along with 2 open gate options. So the max open gate setting is currently only possible in the 420 8-bit SDR. For color space, we have SDR, HDR, P3, and we've got the Apple Log 1 and 2. So frame rates, nothing really to surprise you here, except that we don't get the NTSC frame rates that we do get in apps like the Blackmagic app, for example, the 29.97 kind of thing. But apart from that, only other thing is that if you want to shoot 240 frames per second, as we would expect, you need to switch to 1080p. Now tap where it says AF to open the focus slider. Now when you slide your finger over the slider, you can set focus, and you'll also switch the camera into manual focus mode. If you tap the button at the other end of the slider, you will switch back and forth between auto and manual focus. And to close the focus slider, just tap the button at the top again. You can actually tap inside the frame to set exposure and focus, and you're going to see this square reticle. But if you double tap, you can now separate them out into a focus and a exposure reticle. So the square is focus and the circle is exposure. So wherever you place them, it will set focus or exposure depending on what's in the frame. And if you want to recombine them, just double tap again. To the right of the frame at the top, we have current exposure settings. We've got ISO, EV, and we've got shutter speed. If we tap that area, we're going to open the EV slider. Now, if you want to continue using auto exposure, but you want to adjust it up or down, then use the slider here to set an EV value. To the left of the shutter button is an exposure meter. So the middle is considered correct exposure. And if you look closely, you can see that there's this little red line, and that indicates the current exposure. So if I adjust the EV up and down, you can see the little red line move up and down at the same time. Above the shutter button is the exposure mode setting. Just swipe it to change the setting, and there's 4 modes. We've got A for auto, M for manual, we've got S for shutter priority, and I for ISO priority. In manual mode, to the left, we now only see ISO and shutter speed. So if we tap that area, we're going to open the controls for those settings, and we can slide them up and down to change them. But notice that you now get a new button in the bottom right of the frame. Tap that to switch to shutter angle mode. And we can now set our shutter speed to 180 degrees for that film look motion blur, and then we can adjust ISO for exposure. And of course, we are going to need ND filters for daylight shots. If we switch to shutter speed priority mode, the ISO controller is switched for an EV controller. And now the ISO will adjust automatically while the shutter speed remains locked. And this is actually a feature, as I say, that isn't yet available in the Blackmagic app. If we switch to ISO priority mode, shutter speed is going to be set automatically instead, while ISO is going to be locked. And the reason for using this mode is if you want your ISO at a specific setting. For example, maybe you want to avoid digital noise from a too high ISO setting, and you don't have a specific shutter speed requirement. So I'd say that this would most likely be used in photo mode. Below the AF button, we have the camera picker. Top is the switch for front and rear, and then we have ultra wide, wide and telephoto. Now the ones with the 2 dots next to them have 2 focal lengths. So we just tap them to toggle between the 2 settings. The button with the M opens up settings for moments range of conversion lenses. So you can choose the lens here and then add it to your camera picker. So if I pick anamorphic, for example, I now get an anamorphic button. And if I tap that, it's going to de-squeeze the image. If you only want a de-squeeze preview, tap the settings cog and then toggle off de-squeeze when saving. And if you want to remove a lens from the picker, just long press on it and then tap the trash can. Finally, at the bottom here, we have the zoom control. So tap to open the zoom settings. To change the zoom, you can use the controller here, or you can just slide your finger on the slider. And you can also just do the regular old finger pinch on the screen. And to return to the lowest zoom for the chosen camera, press the reset button. So when you use this zoom, it does not zoom between cameras. It's not going to switch cameras, it's going to stay within the magnification range of each camera. Tap the white balance button and now you can choose between preset white balance settings. If you tap the settings button at the top, you can now set temperature in kelvins as well as tint. If you tap the button beside the tint control, this sets the tint and Kelvin settings to whatever you are pointed at. So you could use this with your grey card and then just tap this button and it's going to set and lock white balance. Or you could just use it as a quick way to set and lock white balance without the card. To go back to auto white balance, just tap the AWB button. If you don't want to set white balance manually, but you do want it to lock on record, which I recommend, then tap the cog button and toggle on this setting. So there's one last button, top right, and all this does is give you a clean interface, and you just tap it again to bring the settings back. Tap on the left where you have these 2 buttons, and that's going to open Capture Utilities, or you can actually just swipe to the right to open them, and swipe again to close them. And these settings are slightly different for photo and video mode. In video mode, we can switch off stabilization, and it's either on or off, so there's no extra levels of stabilization that we get in some other apps. To add the grid overlay, just tap the grid button, and if you just keep tapping, you'll cycle through different types of grid. Level obviously just adds a level meter, and then there's an orientation lock so you can stop it from switching between vertical and horizontal. And we've got these clipping zebras for highlights and shadows with different levels that you can set them at. There's focus peaking settings. So we've got 3 settings here. We can set it to off, or we can set it to manual, and that means you will only see it when you adjust focus, or we can set it to always, and that just means it will always be on. And plus you can also change the color of it. If you switch monitors on, you will get the audio level meters and the exposure histogram. And if you tap the histogram, you can switch between your preferred type. And if you're in photo mode here, you just get a timer instead of stabilization. If we tap the LUT button, we can add a LUT, either as a preview or baked in. Now, if you want to import LUTs that you have stored on your iPhone, select User at the top and then tap the plus button. Navigate to your LUT, select it, and then tap Open. And now you just tap on the LUT to apply it to the preview. At the top, you can actually choose to bake the LUT in instead, but more likely you will want to set this to preview, and that's just going to allow you to color grade your clip when you're editing. And below is a slider which you can use to set the intensity of the LUT. But I'd say that most of the time you just want this set to 100%. And so you can see that it doesn't quite look right, does it? So what we need to do is tap this button that looks like a painter's palette and set input to Apple Log and output to Rec 709. If you tap the star, the LUT will be added to your favorites list of LUTs. If you tap where it says imported, it's going to take you to the location of the LUT on your iPhone. So there's actually 3 pre-imported LUTs that you can use as well that come with the app. So you can tap where it says user and then switch to examples. And we now have 3 LUTs to choose from: black and white, log to 709, and saturate. So that's pretty much it. There are a few other little settings here and there, but that's enough to get you running with this app. But if you do want to learn more about the core settings that we use for any camera app, then I've created a whole course dedicated to that over on Patreon. So go over there, check it out if you want. And also don't forget, on Amazon, I've now got 3 books dedicated to the art of shooting video on your smartphone, so check those out also if you're interested. Other than that, see you in the next video.